"No janitors pass this gate," Colonel Grant Westbrook said, not to Abner Ledbetter but past him, to the guard, as though the old man in coveralls were a spill on the checkpoint asphalt requiring only the correct form to have removed. The old man in coveralls asks the gate guard the same question he always asks, and is turned away before he finishes it. He had gotten as far as, "Do you still keep the," when Westbrook's voice cut the sentence off at the knee. The colonel had a printed run sheet clipped to his sleeve, the morning schedule broken into 5-minute intervals, and a man standing outside those intervals registered to him the way a weed registers to a lawn. He did not look at Abner's face. He looked at the coveralls, at the crooked stitched patch over the breast pocket for a contractor that had folded before the guard at the gate was born, and he made his determination in under 2 seconds, the way a man reads a uniform instead of a person. "He's here every week, sir," the young guard offered, uncertain whether that fact helped or hurt. Behind them, past the chain link and the flight line apron, ground crews in reflective vests moved around a matte drab Apache parked nose out on the ramp, its blades still tied, a wreath of white ribbon looped along its boom for the morning ceremony. Folding chairs stood in crisp rows facing a plywood platform. A banner reading, "Corcoran Army Airfield." Dedication of service hung crooked between 2 light poles, one grommet already torn. "Every week is the problem," Westbrook said. "This is a restricted checkpoint during an active ceremony with press and donor guests inbound in 40 minutes. I don't care if he's been coming since Eisenhower. Log him as a loiterer and get him off the apron sightline before the cameras do. If a name has ever gone missing from a record you helped write, you already know what this gate is about." Abner did not answer. He stepped back from the white line painted at the guard shack the way a man steps back from a stove he already knows is hot, not startled, just informed. He turned his whole body to do it, a slow pivot rather than a twist, favoring a shoulder that had not lifted past his own collarbone in 11 years. His right hand kept its grip on a canvas roll slung under his arm, soft with age, the kind of thing you would mistake for a rolled-up yoga mat if you didn't know what a tool roll was built to carry. Overhead at 1,100 feet and closing on its rehearsed flyover line, the Apache assigned to that morning's ceremony, the same airframe parked wreathed on the ramp, had a sister ship doing the honors, call sign Pathfinder 2-1, banked 4 degrees off its approach heading. Not much. Enough that the flight-following controller in the tower said, 2-1, confirm your line, and got 11 seconds of nothing back but rotor noise before the pilot corrected, smooth as if it had never happened. Nobody at the gate saw it. They were watching Abner Ledbetter walk away from a checkpoint he'd been walking up to on Thursdays for longer than the guard shack had held its current coat of paint, carrying a roll of tools nobody there had asked to see, toward a bench outside the fence where, it would turn out, someone had already saved him a seat. The walk from the county road to the Corcoran gate was 1,140 paces. And Abner Ledbetter had counted them enough Thursdays running that he no longer needed to, the way a man doesn't count stairs in his own house. He came the same hour every week, a little before 8, dressed in coveralls faded from army drab to the gray of a rained-on fence post, the contractor patch on the breast pocket stitched on crooked because he'd done it himself, at a kitchen table 30 years ago, and never seen a reason to redo work that still held. He wore them the way another man wears a suit that fits only him anymore, correctly, out of habit, as if the garment still had a job to do, even if nobody had assigned him one. He carried the tool roll under his good arm, canvas gone soft and dark at the fold lines, hand-stitched along every seam by Clara, back when her eyes could still thread a needle without the magnifier. Inside it, wrapped and sleeved by size, was a set of feeler stock he had filed to his own tolerances in 1989, blades thinner than newsprint at one end, and each one stamped near the tang with 2 letters, A.L. He did not open it at the gate. He had not opened it at the gate in longer than young Harlow's soul, the clerk who logged the visitor book most Thursday mornings, had been alive. But he brought it anyway, the way another man brings a wallet he no longer needs cash from, because leaving it home felt like leaving part of himself unaccounted for. His right shoulder did not rise past his own chest. He had learned to live around that the way water learns around a rock, turning his whole trunk to reach for anything above the height of a mailbox, and it gave his walk a slight rotation, an economy that looked, if you didn't know him, like stiffness, and looked, if you did, like a man who had simply stopped wasting motion decades ago and never started again. Harlow Soule was 22, 6 months into her enlistment, and had drawn gate log duty the way most junior soldiers draw the jobs nobody fights for. She kept a battered olive ledger at the guard shack for visitors who weren't badge holders, mostly delivery drivers and the occasional lost tourist looking for the wrong museum, and somewhere in her second month she'd noticed that the same stooped man came every Thursday, signed nothing, asked nothing of the guard on duty except one question, and left. By her third month she had started setting a folded towel on the far end of the bench outside the fence before he arrived, so the paint-flaked slat wouldn't catch his coveralls. She never told him she did it. He never mentioned that he'd noticed. "Same time as always, Mr. Ledbetter," she said that morning, before the colonel's voice found him at the white line. She had a habit of using his name whole, both syllables of Ledbetter given their full weight, as if shortening it would be a discourtesy she wasn't authorized to commit. "Same time," he agreed. "Logbook still in that shack, or did they finally get you people onto tablets?" It was the same question, nearly word for word, that he'd asked every Thursday for longer than her enlistment, and she still hadn't worked out why it mattered to him whether the airfield kept an actual bound book of who came and went, when the world had long since decided a database did the job better. She'd started to answer that morning. "Still paper, sir? They haven't." When the colonel's voice arrived over both of them, and the question, like most Thursdays, went unfinished, folded back into the tool roll along with everything else Abner Ledbetter carried and never opened. By the time the donor buses began arriving at 10 minutes to 8, the crowd assembling behind the rope line had grown thick enough that Colonel Westbrook had a genuine audience for the correction he intended to make, and men like Westbrook did not waste an audience. He crossed from the guard shack with his run sheet still clipped to his sleeve, past a cluster of Foundation guests in blazers, past 2 local reporters comparing lens filters, past a folding table stacked with programs printed on card stock heavy enough to survive a pocket. Abner had not gone far. He was seated on the bench outside the fence, tool roll across his knees, watching the ramp the way another man watches weather come in, and Westbrook adjusted course toward him with the particular confidence of someone about to demonstrate competence to people he wanted to impress. "This is the man," Westbrook said, to no one in particular and everyone in general, pitching his voice for the rope line rather than for Abner. "I had to have him moved off the checkpoint 20 minutes ago. Comes around in coveralls with a bag of tools, no badge, no appointment, asking the same question every week like he's casing the place for scrap metal." A ripple of polite laughter went through a cluster of donor guests who had no idea what they were laughing at and trusted the uniform to know. "We get this sometimes. Folks think a decommissioned flight line is public property because it used to be. It isn't. This is an active installation with a ceremony in progress, sir, and I need you to understand that means you." He said the word janitor the way he'd said it at the gate, dropped it into the middle of the sentence like a man setting down a tool he expected to pick back up later. "We don't let janitors loiter the flight line during a dedication. No offense intended. There's a difference between respecting history and letting anybody who wandered off a bus stand around it." A few of the donor guests actually turned to look at Abner now, sizing him up against the word, and what they saw confirmed it for them without any further evidence required. An old man, stooped a little through one shoulder, coveralls the color of a fence post, a canvas roll on his knees that could have held rags as easily as tools. Regina Cadwallader, the Foundation's historical director, glanced over from near the plywood platform with the mild, practiced concern of someone checking whether an embarrassment required her intervention, decided it didn't yet, and turned back to her clipboard of remarks. Abner did not stand to answer. He looked up at Westbrook from the bench, unhurried, the way a man looks up from work he intends to finish before he speaks. "I kept that airframe's logbook current for 6 years before you were old enough to read one, Colonel," he said. "And I'd check, if I were you, whether this base still has a maintenance log at all, or just a database that forgot to ask." It was not raised. It did not reach past the second row of onlookers. Westbrook opened his mouth for a reply and found, for reasons he could not have named in that moment, that he did not have one ready, and so he did what men holding a schedule usually do when a sentence doesn't fit the run sheet. He moved on to the next item, waved the reporters toward the platform, and left Abner exactly where he was, which was precisely where Abner had intended to remain the whole time. The bench outside the fence gave a clean view of the ramp if you knew how to watch a flight line instead of a ceremony, and Abner Ledbetter had spent 24 years learning the difference. The rehearsal for the flyover ran on its own clock, separate from the plywood platform and its rows of folding chairs. A crew chief young enough to be somebody's grandson walked the Memorial Apache's rotor arc with a checklist clipped to a lanyard, calling out items to a partner who confirmed each one against a tablet mounted on a rolling stand: blade tie-downs, pitot covers, static wicks. The words came in the clipped rhythm of men who had done this so many times the checklist had become closer to a hymn than an inspection, which was, Abner understood better than most people alive, exactly the failure mode a checklist was supposed to prevent and instead sometimes caused. He watched the ground crew walk the tail rotor driveshaft cover, watched the access panel come open along the aft pylon where the linkage lived, and watched from 40 feet and through a chain-link fence a particular hitch in the shaft's free rotation that no camera in that crowd would have caught, and that the panel's own diagnostic readout, when the technician ran it, returned as nominal: green field, no fault code, cleared for flight. He did not call out. He did not rise from the bench. He sat with his hands folded over the canvas roll and watched the technician run the same check twice, the second time because a supervisor asked for it, not because the first result had raised any flag in the tablet's own mind. And both times the readout came back clean because a diagnostic panel measures what a sensor is built to measure, and no sensor on that airframe had ever been built to feel the particular resistance of a linkage bearing wearing oval instead of round. A wear pattern that shows itself first not as a fault, but as a texture, transmitted up through a wrench into a hand that has held 10,000 of them and knows the difference between smooth and almost smooth the way a man knows his own wife's step on a porch before she's said a word. Harlow, refilling the water cooler near the guard shack, followed his eye line once, twice, and then a third time, and each time landed exactly where he was looking: the aft pylon access panel, open, green light, cleared. "Something wrong with it?" she asked, low, not wanting to be the second person that morning accused of harboring a loiterer's opinions. "Didn't say wrong," Abner said. "Said cleared. Those aren't always the same word." He did not elaborate, and she did not press, though she filed the sentence away the same careful way she'd been filing his Thursdays for 6 months, waiting to see what they added up to. The rotors began to turn at 9:51, a slow tick building to a wash of sound that flattened the grass along the fence line and pushed the ribbon on the boom sideways in a long white ripple. The memorial ship stayed grounded for the ceremony itself. Its sister aircraft, Pathfinder 2-1, was the one scheduled to fly the honor pass, and it lifted off the far end of the runway at 9:58, climbing into a turn that would bring it low and slow across the crowd at exactly 1000 hours, on time, on the run sheet, everything Colonel Westbrook's morning required it to be. Abner watched it climb out with the particular attention of a man listening to an engine and not just watching it, head tilted a few degrees, the good ear forward. Somewhere under the airframe noise, in a register most of the crowd would never separate out from the general roar, there was a texture he recognized the way he'd recognized it on the ground 30 feet away, not 10 minutes before, and his hand, resting on the canvas roll in his lap, went still in a way that had nothing to do with his shoulder. The Apache came in low over the runway threshold at 9:59, on the exact line the run sheet promised, and for 3 full seconds it did everything Colonel Westbrook's morning required of it. Then it didn't. At the point where Pathfinder 2-1 should have held its heading across the crowd and climbed away toward the departure corridor, it banked hard left instead, nose dropping a fraction, and came around in a wide, unhurried arc that brought it back toward the fence line rather than away from it. The tower's voice cracked over the ramp speakers, thin and startled. 2-1, say intentions, and got no answer for 4 full seconds, which is a very long silence when the aircraft making it weighs 11,000 pounds and is descending. The crowd on the folding chairs had gone from murmuring to a single held note of attention. 300 faces turned the same direction at once. Westbrook, mid-sentence at the podium, stopped with his mouth still open on a word about legacy and did not finish it. The Apache sat down on the taxiway apron outside the rope line. close enough to the chain link that the rotor wash flattened the grass around the bench where Abner Ledbetter sat, and the pilot's door came open before the blades had finished their spool down, which was itself a small violation of at least 2 safety procedures that nobody in that crowd was thinking about, because a man in a flight suit was crossing the tarmac at a near run, helmet still under one arm, toward the fence, toward the bench, toward the old man in coveralls who had not moved from where he sat. Brigadier General Maddox Pickens was 45 years old, and he had not run anywhere in a dress uniform in a decade, but he was not wearing a dress uniform, and there is a version of a man that only shows up when the flight suit is still on. He reached the fence, put both hands on the chain link the way another man might put both hands on a gate he'd been waiting years to open, and looked through it at a stooped figure with a canvas roll on his knees, and said, loud enough that the ramp speakers caught it and carried it to every folding chair on that plywood platform, Chief Ledbetter. Not a name. A designation, the kind stamped on old orders and nowhere else anymore, and it landed on that crowd the way a dropped glass lands on tile. Total silence first, then everyone understanding at once that something had broken. Westbrook, still holding the podium's edge, had gotten as far as, "General, I wasn't aware," before Pickens cut through it without raising his voice further, because he didn't need to. The whole ramp had gone quiet enough to hear the rotor blades finish their turn. In 1991, Pickens said, not to Westbrook, not really to the crowd, though every one of them heard it, I put an airframe down hard enough that the crew chief who signed off on it that morning had every right to ground me for a month. He didn't. He spent 11 hours on his knees under that aircraft instead, by himself, third shift, and had it flying again before my flight surgeon cleared me to sit back in the seat. He looked at Abner through the fence the way a man looks at a debt he has carried so long it has become part of his posture. That's the airframe on the ramp behind me, Colonel, wreathed in ribbon for a ceremony that has his signature nowhere on it. The tool roll was still on Abner's knees. He had not opened it. He did not open it now. You didn't need grounding, Abner said, quiet enough that only the ramp speakers made it carry. Needed a linkage bearing reseated is all. Same one your ground crew cleared nominal about 40 minutes ago on a tablet that's never once felt what it's measuring. Regina Cadwallader had come around the side of the platform by then, remarks still in hand, and Colonel Westbrook stood at the podium with a printed run sheet on his sleeve that had no line item for any of this. No 5-minute interval built for a general landing his aircraft on the wrong apron to shake hands through a chain-link fence with a man he'd ordered removed for loitering. The rotors finished turning. Nobody in the crowd said a word. It was, Harlow Soul would think later, the stillest she had ever heard 300 people be at once, and into that stillness General Pickens said the only other thing he seemed to have prepared. Somebody open this gate. Somebody opened the gate, and that was the easy part. What followed it was not. General Pickens crossed onto the visitor side of the fence and took Abner's hand in both of his, which drew the expected gasp from the donor guests and the expected photograph from both reporters, and for a moment it looked, to everyone watching, like the story had already resolved itself. Old hero recognized, record restored, ceremony saved. Regina Cadwallader, moving through the crowd with the smooth economy of a woman used to smoothing things, clearly believed that too. "General, this is a wonderful moment," she said, arriving at the fence with her folder of remarks already reorganizing itself in her hands. "Truly, and we want to honor it properly, but I have to be honest with you about our printed program." She turned the folder so Pickens could see it without quite showing it to the crowd. A glossy insert, the airframe's silhouette, and beneath it a paragraph crediting the aircraft's 40 years of continuous service to Halbrook Systems Group, our longtime preservation partner, whose name was also Westbrook now noticed for the first time in 3 years of reading that program at 3 ceremonies, engraved on the plaque itself, in the line reserved for the technician of record. "The plaque's already cast, General," Cadwallader continued, pleasant, reasonable, the voice of someone explaining a scheduling conflict rather than an erasure. "We have a funding renewal vote with the Halbrook Foundation in 3 days. I don't for one moment doubt what you're telling us about Mr. Ledbetter's service, and we would be honored to acknowledge him, a citation, a private thank you at lunch, whatever feels appropriate. But recasting that plaque publicly, today, in front of the very donor whose name is on it, is simply not something I can authorize on the strength of one recollection, however moving." It isn't a recollection, Pickens said. I watched him do it. And I believe you, Cadwallader said, in the tone of a woman who did not need to be convinced of a fact to decline acting on it. But belief isn't documentation, and documentation is what the Foundation answers to. Abner had not let go of the tool roll through any of this. He sat back down on the bench, unhurried, as if the conversation happening a few feet above his head belonged to other people, which, in a sense, it currently did. There's a work order somewhere with my hand on it, he said, to no one specifically. Not asking anybody to take my word over a plaque, asking somebody to open the drawer. Westbrook, still at the podium's edge with his run sheet now entirely useless, found himself looking at Cadwallader's folder rather than at Abner or the general, and something about the smoothness of her refusal, the readiness of it, the way she'd had the funding vote sentence loaded before anyone had even asked her to recast anything, sat wrong with him in a way he couldn't yet name. He had barred this man from a gate an hour ago on the strength of a coverall patch. He was not eager to discover he'd been right to trust his instincts about who did and didn't belong on this ramp, and something in him, some professional habit sharper than his pride, wanted to check the drawer before he decided which side of this he was standing on. "Ms. Cadwallader," he said, "where's your archive kept?" "Building 4, she said, a half beat too quickly for a woman who just called documentation the highest authority in the world. "But Colonel, I really don't think today is the day to go digging through." "It's exactly the day," Westbrook said, and did not wait for the rest of her sentence, which was, though he did not yet know it, the first decision he would make that morning that had nothing to do with his run sheet at all. Building 4's archives smelled of nothing worth noting and held 40 years of Corcoran's paperwork in steel cabinets nobody had reorganized since the base went joint use, and Colonel Westbrook found what he was looking for in 11 minutes flat, because Regina Cadwallader had filed it exactly where policy required her to and never imagined anyone would come looking. The folder for the memorial airframe held a service history 2 inches thick, and near the back of it, beneath the glossy Holbrook Systems preservation contract dated 1991, was a single carbon copy work order, yellowed at the fold, dated 11 months earlier than that contract's first signature. The handwriting was blunt and economical, the kind of hand that wrote only what needed writing. Rotor mass linkage bearing, custom tolerance, fabricated on station. Signed, A. Ledbetter, Crew Chief. 2 full years before Holbrook Systems Group had ever been awarded a maintenance dollar on that airframe. Westbrook read it twice, the second time slower, and felt something shift in his chest that he would later describe to no one, because there was no one at Corcoran he trusted yet to hear it. Not vindication exactly, and not simple embarrassment, but the specific, quiet vertigo of watching a fact rearrange a story you'd assumed was finished. He kept reading. 3 folders over, in a thinner file marked Fleet Advisory Maintenance, he found the second thing, and this one he had not gone looking for at all. A 2004 incident report, heavily excerpted in the version that had circulated for training purposes, described a linkage-bearing failure on a sister airframe that had forced an emergency landing with no injuries and considerable paperwork. The excerpted version blamed metal fatigue and closed the file. The full report, 3 pages longer than the version anyone had actually distributed, traced the failed parts lineage to a substituted bearing stock Holbrook Systems had begun using in 1994 to cut per-unit cost on a maintenance contract already 3 years under bid, a substitution that met every published specification and failed anyway, because the specification had never accounted for the tolerance Abner Ledbetter had hand-filed into the original linkage a decade earlier. A tolerance nobody at Holbrook had known to preserve, because nobody at Holbrook had known it existed. Westbrook understood, reading it, that the very gate policy he enforced without a second thought, restricted access, no unbadged personnel near active airframes, the rule he'd quoted at Abner that morning like scripture, had been written into Corcoran's standing orders in the aftermath of that 2004 failure to prevent exactly the kind of undocumented, unauthorized tinkering the report's redacted version implied had caused it. He had spent 3 years enforcing a rule built to guard against a version of Abner Ledbetter that had never existed, to protect a fix that was, in fact, the only reason the failure hadn't happened 20 years sooner. He sat with the folder open on the steel table for a long moment, the building silent around him, and thought about the word he had used at the gate that morning, and did not enjoy the thought at all. Then he closed the folder, tucked both documents inside his sleeve where the run sheet used to be, and went back out to the ramp to do the harder thing, which was not proving Abner Ledbetter right in private, but saying so out loud, in the same voice he'd used to be wrong. Colonel Westbrook did not send an aide to fetch Regina Cadwallader quietly aside. He walked back onto the plywood platform himself, in front of the donor guests who had not yet been dismissed, and the two reporters who very much had not left, and asked for the microphone the ceremony's MC was still holding, unused, since nobody had told her what to do with a program that had stopped making sense 40 minutes earlier. "I owe this crowd a correction," he said, "and I'd rather make it in front of you than around you." He held up the work order, not close enough for anyone to read, close enough for them to see that it was real. "This base has a plaque going up today crediting a contractor for 40 years of service on an airframe that a soldier in coveralls kept flying for the first 13 of them on his own hands at his own tolerances before that contractor's name ever touched a work order. I confirmed it in the archive 20 minutes ago. I also confirmed that my own gate policy, the one I used against him this morning, exists because that contractor's later parts failed in a way his original fix had been preventing for a decade. I was wrong twice before breakfast, and I'd rather say that plainly than let a printed program say something false at 10 times the volume." Regina Cadwallader, still holding her folder near the platform steps, opened her mouth once, seemed to measure the room, and said nothing at all, which was itself an answer everyone present understood. "Chief Ledbetter," Westbrook said, and this time the designation came from him, not borrowed, offered like a debt finally itemized correctly. "The plaque gets recast. Tonight, if the foundry will run it, your name goes where the contractor's is now. I'll take whatever the funding vote decides in 3 days, but it won't decide it on a false line." Abner had risen from the bench by then, tool roll still under his arm, and he stood at the base of the platform without climbing it, the way a man stands at the edge of a room he has no intention of being the center of. "Don't need my name up there alone," he said. "There were 2 other crew chiefs on this line before me, kept fixes running on paper credit the same way. Names went missing off other jobs the same time mine did off this one. If you're recasting it, recast it right, or don't bother recasting it at all." Westbrook looked at Cadwallader, who did not meet his eyes, and understood without being told exactly how many names that request would end up touching. "We'll pull every service record this foundation has filed," Westbrook said. "All of them, however long that takes." Harlow Sowell, watching from near the gate she had opened an hour earlier for a general, felt something in her chest settle into place that she did not yet have words for and would not find words for until she was older and had watched a few more records get corrected the hard way. Someone found Abner a folding chair near the platform's edge, though he didn't sit in it long. A staff sergeant offered him a base phone, and he used it the way he used most things, without ceremony, dialing a number he'd known longer than most of the men on that ramp had been alive. "Clara," he said when she picked up. "Might be a little late for the porch light tonight." A pause, her voice audible only as a warm murmur through the receiver, and then, "No, nothing's wrong. Something finally got put right is all. I'll tell you the whole thing over supper." He listened another moment, and something in his face loosened that hadn't loosened once that whole morning. Not at the gate, not on the bench, not even when the general said his name. "I'll still do the truck," he said. "Radio's set to the base frequency already, I imagine, same as every Thursday. I'll check the oil when I'm home, same as every Thursday." It was the ritual nobody on that ramp knew about, and none of them needed to. 50 years married, and every Thursday evening for longer than either of them could now pin an exact date to, Abner checked the oil and tire pressure on Clara's truck before supper, not because she'd ever asked him to, not because the truck ever needed it, but because it was one more thing in a long marriage that got tended whether or not anybody was watching, and that, more than any plaque, was the record he'd never once let go missing. He said he came back on Thursdays to check the logbook, not because anyone still needed him to. 3 days later, the funding vote happened anyway, and it happened in the Foundation's favor, though not in the shape Regina Cadwallader had been maneuvering toward, The Holbrook Foundation, informed in advance of the corrected record rather than blindsided by it in the press, chose to renew the grant and fund the recasting itself, a decision Colonel Westbrook made sure was documented in writing before anyone's memory of the ramp that morning had a chance to soften. Regina Cadwallader resigned from the Historical Foundation 2 weeks after that, quietly, in a letter that used the word retirement, and satisfied no one who had watched the archive get opened. Nobody at Corcoran spoke of her much after. The 2 other crew chiefs, whose names had gone missing from other jobs over the years, were found in the same steel cabinets in Building 4, their original work orders intact under later contractors' glossy paperwork, and their families were located and notified with a phone call each, made personally by Colonel Westbrook, who had discovered somewhere in that week that making the calls himself was a better use of a run sheet than anything he'd printed before. The plaque went back up on a Tuesday morning with no press invited, at Abner's own request, and it read 3 names now instead of 1 contractor's, in the order the work orders gave them, oldest service first. Harlow Sowell stood at the edge of the small gathering that watched it go up in uniform, with a badge that read Records Clerk, where it used to read Gate Log, a reassignment Westbrook had signed the same week he signed the correction order, on the theory that a young soldier who noticed a hand-stitched patch before a colonel noticed a man was exactly who ought to be keeping the airfield's books from then on. The bound log at the guard shack stayed paper, at her insistence, backed up but never replaced, and every Thursday since, she has made an entry that says nothing more than a name and a time, because Abner Ledbetter still walks the same 1,140 paces from the county road most weeks. Though now the guard waves him through the gate itself, and the bench with its folded towel sits mostly unused, kept anyway, the way you keep a chair at a table for someone who might still come. He does not linger long inside the fence when he visits. He looks in on the memorial ship, reads the new plaque without touching it, and walks back out the way he came, because the airfield was never the thing he was tending. That happens 40 minutes down the county road in a garage with 1 bulb over the bench and a radio permanently tuned out of long habit to the same frequency the tower at Corcoran uses, low enough now that it is closer to a hum than a signal. The tool roll lies open there most evenings, canvas soft at every fold, the feeler stock laid out in its sleeves by size, each blade still carrying the 2 letters he stamped into it in 1989, filed to tolerances no factory ever printed and no diagnostic panel has ever learned to read. He does not use them for much anymore. He takes them out anyway, checks them the way another man checks a level on a shelf, and puts them back exactly as they were. Some records only get corrected because somebody kept coming back to check them. The back door opens onto the yard some evenings before he's finished, and Clara's voice carries across it the same unhurried distance it has carried for 50 years, calling him in from whatever he's tending toward the thing she's tended just as long, and he goes, leaving the roll open on the bench under its 1 bulb, the blades laid out true, waiting, the way they always have, for a Thursday that will need them again.